So this paper is about an ongoing research program. I apologize in advance for my IFPRI colleagues who've heard about it a few times now. It's supposed to be new stuff, but it's been going on for a little bit now. But so the idea here is to give you an idea of the broad research program. I should say this is joint work with my two co-authors, Stefan Durkon and Alan Mayosim Tafese, that are here, and it's called Beyond Fatalism, an empirical exploration of self-efficacy and aspiration failure in Ethiopia. And I'm going to try to make a connection with the theme of the conference, so don't worry about it. All right. Wait. Okay. So let me start with fatalism in Ethiopia. Fatalism is actually customarily attributed to poor Ethiopians, and not just in Ethiopia, actually, in many other communities as well, to describe the lack of proactive efforts to better one's own life, and to describe the acceptance that poor seem to display in terms of acceptance of their own circumstances. In Ethiopia, actually, there are a number of common expressions, as described by a paper by Ramato and Kidane, that typically characterize this type of so-called fatalism. One is, for instance, we live only for today. Another one is we have neither a dream or neither a dream nor an imagination. And there are several others. And so, very often in Ethiopia, fatalism by a number of field agents, NGOs, etc., fatalism is used as a way to explain the rather slow socio-economic transformation in the country. And this is where I make the connection with the conference. So our research program, it goes into 4 steps. First, we wanted to explore what is the nature of fatalism? How does it relate to existing and well-defined analytical concepts? Second, what is the usefulness and significance of these concepts in the context of Ethiopia? Again, taking Ethiopia as an example. And I'm going to be talking about these 2 steps here. And then, can we further develop and test theories on the formation of seemingly fatalistic beliefs and implied behavior? And fourth, can we drive policy-relevant tools to address the identified constraints? And so for number 3, I'm going to give you a hint of what we've been doing for the last few months. And number 4, I have no idea. So, first of all, what is the nature of fatalism? There are 2 ways to consider it. One is kind of a useful way, and one is not that much of a useful way. First one is, fatalism is a system of belief. Everything has an appointed outcome which cannot be altered. And here, the idea is not to find any explanation for why people are fatalistic, and the outcome of it is a dead end. Things cannot be changed individually or collectively. Now, another way, a more useful way to describe fatalism is more of a sense of resignation, which is based on the realities of a real-life situation. And so it comes from experience or circumstances, so there are factors that we can trace it to, and it can be related, as I'm going to try and say, to some well-defined concepts. So fatalism, at least the result of fatalism is not actually new, and it has been discussed widely in the literature. In the recent economic literature, for instance, one could understand fatalism as the outcome of fatalism as an underinvestment in one's future because actions are deemed infeasible or useless. And in fact, there are a number of micro-level evidence of low investment despite positive returns, especially among the poor. So there are underinvestments in pineapple in Ghana, underinvestment in fertilizer in Kenya, or in English education in India, and et cetera, et cetera. And there are a variety of explanations that we can group broadly into 2 categories. Some relate to environmental constraints that lead to low expected private returns. We have missing or imperfect markets, lack of information, social constraints, et cetera, et cetera. Others are more related, and they are a bit new in this literature, are more related to the attributes of decision makers, and here it comes to identity issues, commitment failure, preference for status quo, et cetera, et cetera. What we're trying to get at here is a mix of both, basically, to understand how external constraints affect internal logic governing the choices by poor people. And for this, we need to look at how beliefs are formed. And here again, we're not doing anything new, and there's been a lot said for several decades now in the literature. The psychological literature, for instance, we can identify 2 main concepts. One is the locus of control concept, whereby one life outcome is more or less one's feeling about his own life outcome is more or less controlled by himself or by some external agent. In other words, I could be in control of my own success, or I could say that powerful people or luck or God are actually in control of my own success. Another such concept is self-efficacy, which here is a bit different. Basically, self-efficacy is more when one knows the way to improve one's lot, but doesn't believe in his own capacity to put the necessary effort to do it. Another type of literature that relates to this understanding the fatalism from a beliefs perspective is what has been described in the recent economic, though with hints from the anthropological literature, through the aspiration failures concept. And here, basically, poor people are particularly constrained in their capacity to aspire, which in turn could stem from external locus of control or self-efficacy. So what we're going to try and do here is to try and see whether these fatalistic beliefs that we observe in Ethiopia can be related to these concepts, where there are actually some theoretical framework to link them to. The theoretical framework actually have some strong similarities. The psychological perspectives, goals and aspiration, comes from self-efficacy, and self-efficacy stems from 4 main sources. One is mastery experience, which is basically learning by doing. Vicarious experience, which is what you observe from your peers. Social persuasion, emotional strengths. And vicarious experience, which has been identified very often as the most important driver of goal setting through learning from the relevant peers or social models. From the more economic perspective, this recent aspiration failures perspective, the theory is roughly similar, and this is the reason why we're not trying to disentangle these two concepts at this point of our research agenda, but rather to consider them jointly and working with their similarities. So the aspiration failures perspective is based on an aspiration window. I form my aspiration based on what I observe from people around me, people I can identify to, through my characteristics, through their characteristics, and so on. So I start with my aspiration window, then I define my aspiration level, which basically the difference between where I am and where I want to be is my aspiration gap, and this relates to the effort I'm going to put to improve my own future in a nonlinear fashion. If my gap is very little, basically I'm already where I want to be, so I'm not going to put much effort to change that. If the gap is very big, it's just infeasible, and therefore there's no point in me doing so much effort to change it either. And in other words, for medium level of gaps, the effort to improve my own lot are the greatest. So as you can see, there are some strong common features in these trends, in these families of literature. One is the importance of goals in determining one's success. The other is the role of social comparison and learning from peers beyond just information, right? It's a lot about relevant others or people that fall within my aspiration window. And both kind of predict that the poor lack future enhancing comparison. So this is what we're trying to take to the data and in several steps. In 2006, we started with a little standard household survey where we used standard questionnaires with extra module related to aspiration, self-efficacy, locus of control, and others. And specifically, the locus of control question was as follows. We asked individuals, please tell me which of the two propositions you most agree with. A, each person is primarily responsible for his or her success in life. B, one's success or failure in life is a matter of his or her destiny. So this is clearly a locus of control question. In other words, B is an external locus of control. People think that their life is mostly directed by things that are external to their capacities. And we found 35% of respondents indicated that they believed more in B than they believed in A. And this is actually remarkably consistent across various related questions and also various surveys that we conducted later on. So with this in mind, we've run a few correlations to see whether we could find evidence of the theories that I've just outlined. One, for instance, is this relationship between aspiration window and poverty. And here what you see is a positive relationship between self-reported wealth and the probability that I have regular contact outside of my community. Okay, thinking that again these are very abrupt indicator, but just to have an idea, those people that have much less regular contact outside of their communities are those that are likely to have a narrower aspiration window And we see that it is true that poor people seem to have a narrower aspiration window. Now we can also relate aspiration window and locus of control. For instance, we see in the second line that those people with an internal locus of control have much more probability to communicate regularly with at least one person outside of their district than people with an external locus of control. We also see the same for listening to the radio and other indicators. So again, this idea, so going back to the theory, we have poor people have lower restricted aspiration window, or restricted means to relevant others to identify to. And this, in turns, relate to their aspiration. Here, again, proxied by the locus of control question. Aspiration gap and locus of control. We ask people, can you become as successful as your role model within 5 years? And here again, we see, as an indication of aspiration gap. And here again, we see that people that believe more in their own capacity to change their future tend to believe that they can be successful more than people who believe it's more about fate. And we have this for several other indicators. People are willing to change their income earning activity or their living location if they can be more successful. And we see that people with internal locus of control are more likely to take these steps than people with external locus of control. So again, some kind of a correlation between aspiration gap and locus of control. And now lastly, so remember in the theory, we have aspiration window, aspiration gap, okay? And then we, aspiration window, aspiration level, aspiration gap, and then aspiration failure in the sense not being able to invest or not taking the proactive steps to invest in your own future. And so we ask people a hypothetical question. If a banker came to you tomorrow and offered you any amount of loan, how much would you borrow if the loan was for 1 year, if the loan was for 5 years, if the loan was for 10 years? And what we find is that, again, this internal locus of control proxy for aspiration level does correlate quite well with the amount that would be borrowed. In other words, those people with external locus of control, those people that believe more in fate than in effort, would borrow less, something about 15 to 20% less, and they will also invest these resources in more short-term type of investments, such as grain, close immediate consumption, whereas the other ones, the internal locus of control people, would borrow more and invest more towards medium-term or long-term investments such as education or new businesses, etc. So very rapidly, conclusions from these steps 1 and step 2, which again is really an exploratory work. Here we find that external locus of control, self-efficacy, and small aspiration gaps do seem to help understand the idea of fatalism in Ethiopia. We do find the correlation that we would expect according to these theories traced from the psychological or the anthropological economic literature. And here evidence suggests that understood in this sense, fatalism lowers the demand for long-term loans and productive use of loans. Now obviously, the measures that we use are quite rough, and the correlation that we're using are not immune for a lot of sources of endogeneity. So these are the further steps. So first step, we've attempted to characterize fatalism through what we found in the literature. Step 2 was this paper about correlation. Step 3 was another effort that we made towards designing a measurement instrument towards measuring aspiration, measuring different type of related concepts such as self-efficacy, etc. And that we've tested for different issues of reliability and validity, etc. Step 4, I'm going to just give a few words on this, is an experiment, and step 5 should be a replication. I'm saying that because we've been designing this experiment for the past couple of years, and I think we're collecting the last round of data as we speak, so we're kind of getting excited about it. The idea was to produce mini documentaries of local success stories that we screened to randomly selected individuals, and actually the process was a bit more sophisticated than that, in that we varied the intensity of invitation by village in order to try and identify what relates to aspiration window rather than what relates to more role model type of models. And then we measure changes in a set of typically designed instruments to capture aspiration and self-efficacy issue. And also we measure changes, more long-term changes in terms of enhanced participation in a local micro savings program being done by the care NGO. And this is what, you can see it, but it's good. Anyway, thanks.